Hi, I'm Kaylee. Peach is my daddy, and I hope you enjoy his interview. But first, check this out.
When you start anything in the media, you're not going to make money. It takes time, especially in a blog, to grow traffic, to grow readership, that you're building relationships with readers. And that isn't something that you can truly scale like immediately. Like you could buy ads and all that, but if you want to make connections with people, it's like a one-on-one, slow growth. So you got to find those non-financial, non-quantitative things to celebrate as you go on. And it was funny because my wife, who was my girlfriend at the time, I remember telling her, and she jokes about this all the time. I was like, oh, it'd be nice if this paid for one nice vacation a year. And at $100 a month, $1,200, when you're in your 20s, like that's a pretty good vacation. And that's all I had ever envisioned for it.
What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the Money Peach podcast. Today's guest on the show today is Jim Wang. Now, Jim's a good friend of mine. He is also the founder of a few blogs out there. His most recent one is wallethacks.com. Now, Jim is an expert when it comes to just getting started. Now, I know so many of us have these great ideas to start a business, to start a blog, a podcast, a YouTube channel, whatever it might be. But for some reason, we're just not getting started. Jim's going to talk us through why we're not getting started, what he did to be very successful, and we're going to talk about how he created a little hobby blog that he sold for a few $1 million in just a few short years. So without further ado, let me bring on Jim Wang, currently the founder and creator of wallethacks.com. Jim, thank you so much for coming on the show. Jim is a dear friend of mine. Met him a few years ago when I jumped into the blogosphere. He's one of the first people I met. He's a bigwig. We're going to talk about Jim's extreme rise to being one of the most successful bloggers early on, and then he does it all over again for a second time. But Jim, welcome to the show.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me on.
I'm going to introduce you here as Jim Wang. You're the founder of bargaineering.com, and you're also the founder of wallethacks.com. I met you through Wallet Hacks. We met at a conference a few years ago. You've been actually, you probably don't realize this, but a lot of the success I have in my blog was picking your brain and learning a lot of things about blogging from you, because I don't want to say this, but you're kind of a dinosaur in the blogging world. You started like 1 million years ago.
Yeah, it's been a while. 2004, 2005. It's kind of you to say. A lot of people will ask questions and ask for advice and, what would you do? You'd be surprised. Actually, you probably experienced this too now that you're getting up there in age. A lot of people just don't do it. They want to ask you for advice and say, what's the magic bullet? And you may give them the magic bullet. They just don't want to use it. Thank you for the compliments, but kudos to you for actually doing the work.
Well, if it sounds hard, that means it's worth doing. There's that whole saying that for everything worthwhile in life is uphill. I think it was John Maxwell that said that. And he's right. If it's worth doing, it's not easy. If it's easy, everybody does it. It's no longer worth doing. What's worth doing, and it's going to be hard. And you were always straight up and said, starting a blog is not easy. It's hard, but it's worth it. But let's talk about bargaineering. Before you started bargaineering, let us know what you were doing for a living and kind of where you were. I think this was around 2004, 2005.
Yeah, so I just started work. I graduated college, computer science, was working in the defense industry. If you sort of know the timelines around that time, it was like after the dot-com boom, it was like sort of the rise of the defense industry because of 9/11 and all that. I just started working. It was one of those things where also around that time, blogging started to become a little more popular. I mean, it's when people had blogs kind of like on Friendster and MySpace and talking about their day. It was like, way before the days of Twitter when people talk about what they had for breakfast and things like that. And one of the things I was learning about was money. It always interested me because it's something that's complicated and not talked about in school. And I wanted to learn about it. And I figured, why not start sort of like a journal online? And that's kind of how bargaineering started. It was just a blog that talked about money because I didn't know anything about it.
I'm pulling up an article here. It's from Mashable. It's a 2010 article, and it talks about the past 5 years of blogging. So you got to think when this was written in 2010, it's talking about 2005 up to 2010 and kind of the growth in blogging. And at the time, it says in 2005, so the time when you started bargaineering.com, there was about 14 million blogs. But get this, the blogosphere was growing at a rate of 80,000 blogs per day. And back then, no one was really blogging full-time for a living. Not like you see the numbers today. This was more of, like you said, kind of like a hobby blog, correct?
Yeah. People were just talking about what happened that day and sharing it with their friends. And it's really not that much different than people putting status updates today on like Facebook and things like that.
Which makes sense. I mean, people put status updates on their Instagram page, for example. And we have a couple friends that they do really well. They have a couple million followers on Instagram, and that's how they make their full-time income is they post what they did during their day on Instagram, and they have some sponsors for that. And they do really, really well. And so, looking back at blogging, it's like now I kind of see that trend with social media. But not to get off topic here. So you're a software engineer, correct, in the defense industry.
Yep.
So what
was I thinking? Like, why did I start a blog when there were 14 million others?
There you go. Yes.
To be honest, I just didn't know that there were 14 million others, right? It's just something I thought would be fun, and you start doing it. One of the interesting things is, so I had a full-time job, and I start this on the side, and it doesn't make any money for a couple of years. But I didn't care because I just kept it as a journal, and no one writes a diary thinking they're going to sell it and make millions of dollars. They're just writing it because it's an outlet. It's a way for them to learn, things like that. And so I'm actually glad I didn't know that there were 14 million. Even still, like you were telling me another stat like today, it's far more. I just think if you want to start a blog or start anything, like just the first thing is just start it. Don't worry about the stats and all that. Like just jump right into it and just do it.
One of the biggest hiccups I see that people have, Jim, and this was me in the beginning as well. And I remember you kind of talking me out of this mindset. I was like really not embarrassed, but I was like, I didn't want anybody out there to know that I was a full-time firefighter because I had a blog talking about money. And in my mindset was saying, well, I'm not qualified to talk about money because I'm not from the banking world. I don't have a degree in personal finance. I'm a full-time firefighter. What gives me the nerve to go ahead and write about money? So it's almost like this secret identity I had for a while. You were like, that might be one of your strengths. How many full-time firefighters are out there are talking about this money thing? And so kind of looking at you, I'm looking at your history. You were an engineer and you started talking about, your 401k and different finance things. Did you ever feel that way? And how did you overcome that?
When I look back on it, I think mostly it was just ignorance. I just didn't think that people would even read it. So I didn't really care that I didn't have the qualifications. And I don't have the qualifications. I still don't have the qualifications. I'm not a certified anything. I'm not a financial advisor. And that's totally fine because I think that people look to blogs as a way to read other people's stories, as a way to relate and say, oh, that person understands, or at least is going through similar things. And so they gravitate towards people that may be similar to them and just want to read their stories. And it doesn't matter that you're not an expert in whatever you're talking about. Like if you think about it, if you started a blog about mountain biking, and there aren't that many professional mountain bikers, right? But you could start and just talk about your journey and learning and growing as a rider, and people will enjoy it and will follow you, not because you should be an expert before you can write about it, but because you're just like a step or two ahead of them. And they're following your journey. Like, oh, well, if I'm a beginner, I don't need like $1,000, $10,000 gear. I just need like a little bit here, a little bit there. Here's where I should judiciously spend my money. And they get it. And you don't need to be an expert. It's the same with finance. Like a lot of the financial concepts are fairly simple. Everyone gets caught up like investing. Should I invest in this and that, whatever? Like forget all that. You don't need to be a financial advisor to know that step one is you need to save more money. People do not save enough money. You don't need to be an expert to explain to everyone that they need to save more money and stop spending as much as they are, right? Don't get into credit card debt. If you are in debt, try to pay that off as aggressively as possible. You don't need to take a test and get letters after your name to dispense that advice. And you don't need to be anyone special to understand that that advice is correct. And so I think a lot of times people get caught up on this, like, I'm not an expert. Like people don't want to listen to experts. If they did, they could go out and buy 1 million books. They could go over seminars, whatever. They want to hear stories and they want to hear inspirational stories that get them moving. That's what bloggers can provide. And with whatever personal experience you have, if you bring that story into your site, people are going to connect with that.
I think that goes back to the whole marketing 101 thing that, you hear, over and over again is, facts tell and stories sell. I mean, I always tell people, don't start a blog and think you're going to make money, right away. It's going to take a couple of years. If you're really good, it might take only 1 year, but to make any kind of money, you have to have a following. And the way you build a following is, like you said, they can go and get every book off the shelf or find whatever they want to get the facts on how to do A, B, and C. But what changes people, what causes them to move in a direction that they want the change in is a story. And that story aligns them with, wow, if they could do it, maybe I could do this as well. Or, wow, this story sounds just like me. I look at a post on our blog. It was actually the craziest thing. The very first post we ever wrote, it was me on Money Peach. I literally didn't even know how to write a blog post. I just did it all in Word and just copy and pasted it. in the first couple months, no one read it. And then all of a sudden, 3 months later, I don't know if you want to call it viral, but it got shared like 35,000 times on social media in a course of about a 2-week period. Basically, what happened is somebody found this story compelling because somebody shares and says, this is just like us. And it was our story about how we got deep in debt because we were stupid. And then we decided to pay it all off because we were done being stupid, in a nutshell. And that got shared over and over again. And I didn't realize until you just said it that, that story got shared. And then a couple other posts I put out there were on how to get out from a car lease or something like that, which is great information, but that's facts. Every time I've shared a story of a debt-free story, getting out of debt, or something like that, I think that's where people find out that, wow, that's like me. I want to read this. I want to share it with my friends. I want to talk about this versus the facts. So is that what you did in the beginning with Bargaineering that grew it to be so popular, after just a few years?
I did it unintentionally. If I saw myself as just being a couple steps ahead and just doing a lot more reading, I just sort of shared the things that I was learning. As an engineer, I think I gravitate more towards the fact side than the story side. But all the posts would start with a story of like how I started thinking about this and how this fits into my life. And so that on sort of like a very lightweight type of way was telling the story. People make an emotional connection with that story, more so than they would with facts. And so if you're able to leverage that, it's going to be a powerful force for you to spread that story. I mean, if you look at a lot of very popular books, they have all these different ideas, but they surround them with these stories. And so now today, back when I started Bargaineering, I wasn't as savvy. Today, I try to put more of my story into it. I mean, back then, I think people weren't sharing as much on the internet. And so there was a hesitancy. Like I never used my wife's name on Bargaineering just because there was still a sense of like, there are a lot of weirdos on the internet. And so I was a little more hesitant to share the story, less so than I am, say, today.
I just got done reading this book, Jim, called Contagious. We'll put the links in the show notes to it, but it's a book called Contagious by a guy named Jonah Berger called Contagious, Why Things Catch On. It's this college professor who him and his team put together this study of why certain things catch on and why they don't. And there's 6 different factors. And the 6th one that he talks about, to your point, is stories. And he says people don't think in terms of information. They think in terms of narratives. These stories, they carry messages. I started processing this and I thought to myself, that's exactly right. I can easily go and tell somebody a story after just seeing it one time. I can tell the story and I can, relay that information. But when I'm trying to learn a fact, it's like it doesn't stick in my brain. It doesn't stick because there was no story attached to it. So if somebody tells me that, there's a fact that this many people are not saving money in their 401k, that's a fact. But if somebody tells me this story or shares a story about how they weren't saving their 401k, then all of a sudden they went broke and then they realized they didn't have enough money. They paid off all their debt so they could save their money in their 401k. That story is going to resonate with me and cause me to take action versus a fact that says, hey, 1/3 of Americans don't save enough. Okay, that's interesting. I hope I'm in the 2/3. Next.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
You also remember like faces and names and things that because they just stick out and that there's like a person behind that story and that this is something that another human being experienced. In the case of not having enough savings, like you don't want to experience that personally. And that's a very visceral reaction.
Speaking of stories, then, I want you to come on the show to talk about your story. You're very humble. You don't like to share it a lot. So I had to go Google you, and I found an article on Forbes magazine here. And it says, Jim Wang, former software engineer turned professional blogger. How he turned a blog from nothing to a 7-figure blog in less than 5 years. Okay, so I think I just grabbed everybody's attention. You started with Bargaineering. You build it up. According to this article, you will never tell me this, but according to this article, you sold it for $3 million. This is per the Forbes article. I want to know that story. How did you go from starting this blog very early on, 2005, there's 14 million other blogs, 80,000 of them are popping up every single day. And this software engineer who has a full-time job decides I'm going to start one talking about personal finance where I don't have any degrees or letters next to my name. And 5 years later, I'm going to sell this for a good chunk of change. What was that transition?
So I started the blog 2005. And like I said, just wanted to be a journal, sharing my story. To sort of put you back in those times, the economy was starting to get going again. Still before the Great Recession, you had the housing boom. People were borrowing a lot of money, getting credit cards, doing all that. There's a tremendous amount of interest in personal finance. And, you said there are 14 million blogs. Fortunately, I didn't know about it. But what happened was when I started, I knew zero personal finance blogs. A couple weeks into it, I started meeting a couple other folks that not meeting in person, just like internet emails and instant message chatting with them, and sort of build like this little community of like 5 or 6 blogs. So we chat every so often. I became really good friends with a couple of them, despite never meeting them. And if you could imagine in like the mid 2000s, this is still like a very odd thing to have like internet friends that you've never met and that you talk to on like a weekly basis. It sort of like built this community that in a sense kind of kept me going, because remember, the blog wasn't making any money. I still had a full-time job. Like I was working, I was keeping up with it as a hobby at night, on weekends, things like that. It wasn't until about 6 months into it, I get a call from a reporter from the New York Times. And she's like, oh, Jim, I'd like to talk to you. I wasn't anonymous. I'd like to talk to you about your budget, because a couple of the posts were just me sharing like how much I was spending on clothes and whatever, and tracking my budget in an Excel spreadsheet. And so that resulted in like a Sunday little puff piece feature that included my photo. And I'm from New York. And I told my parents to go to like the 7-Eleven to pick up a newspaper, and they go, and my mom buys like 20 copies and gets like super excited to cement home the power of story, as mundane as it may sound. But sharing your net worth in 2005 with like how much you spent on clothes and coffee and food, whatever, got you in the New York Times. I mean, even today, there are people talking about net worth and getting, features in Forbes and other places. But that sort of sustained me up until the point where the site started making a little bit of money. If you start anything and you don't think it's going to make money, and then it suddenly starts making, like $100 a month, that's real money. That's stuff that you paid out student loans, do a lot of different things. $100 doesn't sound like a lot until you start thinking about it. Like, oh, this gets me a little bit closer. And you know what? I have a lot of hobbies where I don't make any money, and that costs me money. So this is actually a pretty good hobby to keep at. I would just continue writing about the different financial aspects of my life, like credit cards, setting up brokerage accounts, things like that. And I quickly discovered, in part with some help from these other blogging friends, that there's this whole world of affiliate marketing where you can get paid if you help people find a new credit card, open up a bank account, things like that. And that's how the site made money, was just helping people find these different financial products. And these financial services companies, I mean, they're spending millions, hundreds of millions of dollars on advertising, on TV and newspapers, on online, whatever. And if they can pay you a little bit to guarantee credit card approval or a bank account application, they'd rather do that than buy another billboard. And so that was sort of the economics of the business and how it was able to grow as large as it did.
When you started it, right, you have your mom and your dad, and maybe you and your girlfriend are reading Bargaineering, right?
Yeah.
5 years later, this is, I'm guessing, 2010 time, according to this article here. It's a very popular blog. You're getting lots of traffic. The thing I want people to realize is that did not happen overnight, right? It was like you said, nights and weekends. It was your hobby, so you enjoyed it, but nights and weekends of, working on your blog for the first year, making nothing. And blogs aren't expensive to start. So it's not like you're losing money. You're just basically losing a lot of time and money, right? Because you could be working and making money, but your hobby. But then fast forward to 2010, you've put in a lot of time, a lot of effort. I think what separated you, Jim, from so many is you didn't really care about the money in the beginning because you are passionate about blogging, but also is you didn't quit. I use this stat all the time on the show, but 90% of entrepreneurs will fail in the first 3 years, meaning they give up. 3 years later, 4 years later, 5 years later, you're still around, you're still blogging. So what happened? I mean, did you approach a company and say, hey, would you like to buy me? Or how did that go down?
To roll it back a little bit, why didn't I ever quit? Even making, $100 a month. My salary was like $65,000 a year, right? Working in the defense industry. And $100 a month is definitely way below minimum wage if you talk about the amount of time and effort put in to make that $100. But there would always be, every like couple months, everything would be like stagnant. There wouldn't be much traffic growth on the site. Like I wouldn't get as many comments as I thought on a post that I spent a ton of time on. But every so often there would be something that sort of gave me a shot in the arm. Right? That New York Times feature was like in the fall, and I started the blog in the spring. So it was like 6 months in, just 4 people visiting, like you said, my parents, maybe my sister, probably not my sister, and then my girlfriend. And so for 6 months, it was like that. And then I was like, maybe I don't need to do this thing. It's kind of fun, but you get a shot in the arm. I think if you're not 100% emotionally committed, no matter what, like it's easy to give up. What you should do is try to look for those non-financial like shots in the arm to sort of give you that motivation to just go even farther and farther and farther and just not give up. When you start anything in the beginning, you're not going to make money. It takes time, especially in a blog, to grow traffic, to grow readership, that you're building relationships with readers. And that isn't something that you can truly scale like immediately. Like you could buy ads and all that, but if you want to make connections with people, it's like a one-on-one, slow growth. So you got to find those non-financial, non-quantitative things to celebrate as you go on. And my wife, who was my girlfriend at the time, I remember telling her, and she jokes about this all the time. I was like, oh, it'd be nice if this paid for one nice vacation a year at $100 a month, $1,200, when you're in your 20s, like that's a pretty good vacation. And that's all I had ever envisioned for it. To fast forward and talking about sort of the end of that particular journey, it was around the time that a bunch of different blogs were getting acquired. And so in my case, I actually just talked with the same brokers that did the deal for a bunch of other sites like Get Rich Slowly and 5 Cent Nickel. That was happening all around that time. There are various sites, like you can go from the marketplace end of like Flippa to actual website flippers themselves. And you can find a buyer. If you have an asset that has value, it won't be too hard to find a buyer.
Hey guys, I just wanted to pause and take a second to say thank you from me to you for listening to and supporting the Money Peach podcast. Without listeners like you, this show definitely would not be possible, so thank you. The number one question that I receive is this: Peach, I just don't know where to start when it comes to my money. So many of us out there are living paycheck to paycheck. We have tons of debt. We're not making any headway. We can't save any money. We want to go on a freaking vacation where we pay cash for it. Oh, and let's talk about retirement savings and kids' college planning on top of that, right? Where do you start? Well, that's why we created the cash flow formula. The cash flow formula is the same system that Andrea and I used to pay off $52,000 in debt in only 7 months. And the best part is it's 100% free, meaning we are going to send you the free tools and a free lesson on how to set up your own cash flow formula. So to get started, go over to getcashflowformula.com. That's getcashflowformula.com. Once again, head on over to getcashflowformula.com to get your free copy and your free lesson on how to get started the right way. All right, guys, now back to the show. How did you value your blog at, and I know you're not allowed to say this, but it's on Forbes, so I'm going to say they told me, but how did that get valued at a $3 million blog? I think that for so many people, it's like, how did you start this thing as a hobby? And then why would somebody pay $3 million for it at the time?
For me, I always thought if I can get 2 buyers bidding on it, then I know that we can reach a fair market price, right? If you only have 1 buyer, it's hard to know. Are they undercutting? Are they foolish and they're willing to overpay? In that case, I'm totally fine with someone overpaying. But as the seller, you don't really know. If you have an auction of some kind, then you can find out how much it's really worth. And in my particular case, it was an auction type scenario where there was more than one interested party. And so that's how I knew that the price in that case was a fair one. If you want to get into the sort of the nuts and bolts, you have people that are investors that view it as a strict financial investment. They're like, oh, it makes $100 every year. I'm willing to pay 5 times that or 3 times that or whatever the multiple may be. And then you have companies where they're sort of like in the related industry and they're like, oh, well, this person makes $100 a year right now. If we buy that asset, then we can make easily tomorrow $200 because of our relationships, and we can do all these different optimizations immediately and make even more. You can ask other entrepreneurs. There are always sales of every type of business happening all the time. And you can get like a current sense of how much are buyers paying for that type of site. It's always generally going to be a multiple of your revenue or your profits rather. So you just have to find out what the latest is.
That makes sense. I have a buddy in an unrelated industry, just to use easy math numbers. He used kind of like a 3 times rule. So if a business makes $100,000 a year profit, he likely could sell it for about $300,000. And, he was saying that's how he's always bought and sold businesses, was using that type of math. I don't know if it's the same with blogs, but that type of math works. But like you said, blogs a little more are different because they already have a bunch of assets. They could grab your blog, add them to their list of assets, grow traffic, be more efficient with it because they already have systems put in, and they could take your $100 a year and turn it into $200 a year with relatively little effort.
Yeah, it actually gets even more interesting when you talk about public companies. And public companies do this a lot. If you look at their stock price, right, they'll have a multiple on their, with the price to earnings ratio. Public companies, their price to earning ratios are often very large. They're not going to be 3 times. Like, we're talking about like internet companies and things like that. They'll be like 25, 30 times. So if they can buy your revenues for 3 times and the market is giving them 30 times, they could just acquire sites for their revenue and they'll get paid by the marketplace for them. They're valued at 30 times and they're paying you 3 times, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a win for them. And, if the blogger's comfortable or whoever's selling the asset is comfortable at 3 times, which, you see that very often, it's a win-win because, like you said, because of that valuation. But you sell your blog, Bargaineering. So now you've just been blogging, for 5 years, Jim. Every weekend, every night, it's kind of like your baby. You sell it and wow, you got paid. That's great. The crazy thing is I didn't know you and I didn't meet you during Bargaineering. I met you a couple years later when you were about a month into your new blog, Wallet Hacks. And so the reason why I wanted to transition and talk about this is, so we just told an all-star story where you start from the ground up. It's almost like a made-for-TV movie, right? Started from the ground up, worked on the nights and weekends, didn't get paid anything for the first year. It caught on. You had some really good breaks, good fortune. You got in at the right time. Only 14 million blogs, which sounds like a lot, but I'm going to hit you with some truth here in a minute. And sell it for $3 million. Now you decide, okay, I'm going to try to do this all over again. I'm going to start another blog. But when you started this other blog, now there's 400 million blogs out there. Not 14 million, 400 million blogs out there. You decide to start Wallet Hacks. The reason why I want you to share the story is because this was powerful for me. Because I remember, Jim, when I started Money Peach, it was like you said, it was a hobby. I was sharing stories about how I got out of debt, how I drive a beater car to work, and all these other things. And I found out there was this guy, Jim, who was a very successful blogger who, was in Forbes magazine, but now he's just like me. He's just back at ground zero. In fact, my blog, Money Peach, was like 3 months ahead of yours as far as getting started. So what was that like starting all over again?
It was actually kind of fun, to be perfectly honest, because when you get to a certain size, there are things that you can't do because they just no longer make sense because the site's too big and like you should be focusing on larger strategic things and not going after like little this and that. I was able to just approach Wallet Hacks like it was a hobby again, right? Because I didn't need it to make money. It was a fun thing. And to be honest, like I think the personal finance community is one of the most fun, like coolest groups it's a big group, but it's like a very chill and everyone's friendly. And I haven't met anybody yet that I didn't get along with. And so I just kind of wanted to get back into it. You had that stat. It's like there are 400 million blogs. Like, why would you go start another one? Like, to your point, it's because there isn't one written by me. Right. And I think I don't think the world needs a blog written by Jim Wang, but I think it's my particular voice and my particular perspective isn't there anymore. I would just like to add and share to it. Like you had mentioned, why would anybody read your blog? I still to this day don't know a single other fireman who's writing about personal finance. I haven't gone looking for it because I am myself not a fireman, but it's not like there's another one out there that is hugely popular and hugely successful. Like, everybody's voice has value. Don't knock yourself down just because there are so many others. Before there were blogs, there were other platforms and there were people you could start a YouTube channel now. I don't know how many YouTube channels. And yes, you start with 1 subscriber yourself and you just grow from there. And as long as you keep going and you don't stop yourself, here's the fun thing. No one can fire you from this job. no one's going to say stop doing it. I mean, they may say it, but you don't have to listen to them because people on the internet, there are commenters who are just trolls on the internet who will tell you that you're terrible and blah, blah, blah. Just ignore them. But no one can ever take this away from you. If you start a blog, no one can truly like shut it down and say you're done and delete everything. Like you're in complete control. And I think there's something powerful about that, which is part of the appeal for me. And I mean, it's like building your own piece of internet real estate, right?
Yeah, it's something that you own, you have full control over. No one can take it away from you. And you can't get fired.
Whatever you want. You could do whatever you want. And if it doesn't work, you can just delete it or ignore it and pretend it never happened. I used to write, and this is absolutely absurd when I think back on it. I used to write 3 articles a day. 1 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon, and then like a short one in like the late afternoon for 4 days every week, Monday through Thursday. And then on Friday, I did this thing. I called it Your Take, where I just had this very short article. People just commented. And it was a fun thing. But that's it's over a dozen articles a week for 5 years. I probably took like a couple breaks, so I wrote like 1 a day. That's a tremendous amount. And if you try to go to the site now, it no longer exists. So the internet is also very, ephemeral. So if you do something that doesn't work well, you can delete it. Don't feel bad. And if you do something and it surprises you and it does really well, no one can take it away from you.
Jim, someone that's listening right now that has an idea to start a blog on whatever, it could be, like you said, mountain biking to personal finance to real estate to something so niche specific that I'd never even heard about. I remember I met this lady, she was starting a blog on how to bathe large animals. She was a vet. And I'm like, wow, that is really niche specific. But whatever their niche is, whatever their expertise is, or whatever they feel like they're an expert at, if they're like, okay, I'm not a podcaster, I don't want to use my voice, but I do want to start a blog, what would the advice be that you would give them?
Just get hosting, get WordPress, throw it up, and then start writing. So do that. But then number 2, try to find, no matter what it is, bathing large animals. Like you're going to find someone else that's in a similar area and just like reach out to them and just say hello. Say, hey, I'm starting a blog on this. And you may think, oh, this is such an obscure, odd thing. Everybody listening knows there's a lot of weird stuff on the internet, and bathing large animals is definitely not even close to something that I would consider, super weird or niche or something that would even be hidden. You'll find other people to talk to. And if nothing else, like it'll be a fun little outlet for your creativity. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like there's nothing wrong with starting a blog, making zero money on it, but having fun and like meeting other interesting people. And maybe you learn a different way to wash a really large animal that you didn't know before. But that other person was also, embarrassed about starting a blog or a podcast about it. And now you've met, now you've shared information. Not everything's about making money directly from your blog. It's a fun outlet. You make these relationships. That's good enough. And these are things that would never have happened if you never started something. Right? You could start it and then figure it out afterwards. If you look at my first couple of posts, they're terrible. I had a writing tutor in high school. I couldn't even get a good score on the SAT writing exam to get into college. Today, I write for a living. Like that's absurd. It's because you just started and you'll figure it out.
So there you go. You have somebody who literally just said he had to get a tutor for writing, but then yet he goes and writes articles 3 times a day, 4 days a week, and then sells his blog for an undisclosed amount of $3 million. Yeah, so you don't have to be the subject matter expert or an expert in writing or anything like that. You just have to start. One thing Jim did right early on is he started. And so if you're out there, I know there's so many people who have an idea for a podcast or have an idea for a blog or a YouTube channel or something that's new that is coming out that they want to try, and they get ready and then they push pause because they say, well, there's already somebody doing that. I'm not going to do it. Guess what? When Jim started, there was 14 million. And then when he started his second blog, there was 400 million. When I started my podcast, there was 525,000 other podcasts out there. I'm a stats guy, so I looked it up and I'm like, cool, I'm going to be 525,001 podcast. It doesn't matter how many there are, how many people are doing it. What Jim said hit home for me is there's nobody named you doing that, right? Only you would be doing that. Just get started. And so we'll put links in the show notes if you're interested in starting a blog. We'll put a link in there on how do you get a domain name and all that technical stuff. It's very simple. You got to think about this. There's 400 million blogs out there. They've made it so simple to get started. If 400 million other people could do it, I promise you could get started today as well. Jim, before we hang up here, I'm a big believer in getting started with reading, leaders or readers type thing. I'm always trying to read a book, find a new book to read. And so I use this podcast to basically vet out what are some good books out there. So the question I have is, if you could only recommend one book for the rest of your life, what would it be and why?
So the one I always think of when it comes to personal finance is Ramit Sethi's I Will Teach You to Be Rich, which is, I'm sure he'd admit, a spammy sounding title. The reason why I like it is because it essentially was the first book I read that taught you about automating your finances and sort of taking a lot of these very manual activities, making them automatic. It's not like David Bach's Automatic Millionaire, where he talks about how you should automatically save towards your 401k and how that's effective. These are like very tactical. This is how you set up this account. This is how you can connect them. And it just saves you a tremendous amount of time. As we all know, like we only have so much time and energy to deal with sort of these nuts and bolts maintenance issues. Like if you can automate as much as you can, that gives you more energy to do anything else. Okay, so we'll put links to Ramit's book, I Will Teach You to Be Rich. And then also, I think you made a good point too, is Automatic Millionaire, another great book if you're thinking in the personal finance space. And Jim, the last question I have for you is, if I were to pick up your phone right now and look at the home screen on your phone, what would I see? You would see my daughter smiling, giggling. It's my family. All righty, Jim. Hey, thank you so much for coming on the show. Head on over to wallethacks.com, just like it's spelled, wallethacks.com. It's probably one of the best looking websites out there. Jim writes all of his own content. It's really, really, really good. A lot of times I'm doing research for a post. I go to Wallet Hacks because I know he puts out some of the best stuff. So if you want to look at Wallet Hacks as far as getting ideas for starting your own blog, or you want to find some of the best hacks out there for your money, head on over to wallethacks.com. We'll have links in the show notes as well. Thanks, man. I appreciate it. And just like that, we wrap up another amazing episode of the Money Peach podcast. All the show notes, the links, anything that Jim and I talked about can be found over at moneypeach.com/session112. That's moneypeach.com/session112. Special thanks goes out to my producers, Steve Stewart, and my assistant, Kayla Sloan. Without them, this show would not be possible. Stay tuned next week for episode 113, where I bring on an expert when it comes to everything student loans. In fact, he has helped people pay down over $300 million in student loan debt. And get this, he's helped people save over $60 million in student loan interest. Yes, $60 million. You're not going to want to miss it. Thank you guys so much for listening. Have a great week, and God bless you. Boom,